So hello everyone, my name is Christina Tenorio, and if you don't know me yet, I'm a SSH staff member in the education department. I primarily work with SimOps, the new best practices workshop. It was previously called Regional Simulation Workshop, and Women in Leadership, and these Monday webinars. Just some housekeeping notes. These webinars are recorded and the recording will be posted tomorrow on the same link to where you registered, the SSH webinars page. And that's the only real announcements I have before we get started. So I'd like to hand it over to our SSH president, Julie Maxworthy.
Hello and welcome everyone. As Christina mentioned, I'm Julie Maxworthy. I'm currently the president of SSH board, and I am so excited to have you all here today to hear about this amazing project. I had a very, very small part in it, but it's been a team that has been incredibly productive, and I know you all are going to gain a great deal of knowledge from this presentation. I also need to mention to you that no one on the team has any disclosures. So without further ado, let's move it forward.
Thank you so very much, Julie. It's very exciting to see in the chat box how many different areas are represented. So welcome everyone from across the world. You can go to the next slide. Great. So thank you also for all the 25 organizations that have been supporting us in the dissemination of this work. Just to name some that our team members are representing, which would be the Society for Simulation in Healthcare, IPSS, Inspire, SESAM, and many, many more. So thanks to the organizations for their support. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm sure that a lot of us have been going through some transitions since the coronavirus pandemic. And the way that our team, the Healthcare Distance Simulation Collaboration, started looking at this is, instead of seeing this as a roadblock, let's turn obstacles into opportunities. We are all coming together, and first of all, I would like to give you some background on what type of work has been done, what type of work was leading us up to the survey, and why is it even important that we all come together and talk about this. Let's talk about what distance simulation even means. A lot of you, I know, have already gained experience in it, but also for the ones on this call that are more novice, I want to introduce the concept of what we're even talking about. So these slides are complemented by Todd Chang. So thank you, Todd, for letting us use them. Here you can see on the left side in purple, a mannequin, then a blue operator, facilitator, and a learner. So just this is what we're going to use as, as pictograms to show you what we're talking about. In a typical simulation, and I'm just going to call it typical, meaning everybody's in the same room at the same time performing a simulation. This is what you can see here in this box. But maybe the facilitator could be at home and debriefing from home. So simulations could be separated geographically, by time, or by geography and time. So not even everybody needs to be in the same place at the same time to perform a simulation together. So here you can see how you could have different combinations of maybe the facilitators at home, or the operators at home, the learner is at home, everybody's at home, or everybody is local. What we have been working on with the Healthcare Distance Simulation Collaboration for about a year now, everything started last April, right after the COVID pandemic hit us the hardest, were different simulation efforts really for us to understand better the concept of what are we talking about in distance simulation. The first one would be a group looking into taxonomy. Is it remote simulation, telesimulation, distance simulation? Establishing a terminology for that. We had a summit, a healthcare distance simulation summit last August, where we really went into a Delphi process, very geeky, you should join us next time, about the nomenclature, as well as a framework. Then we conducted, and we're still conducting, a scoping review, extensive literature review, as well as created a pictogram team looking into how can we best display the distance in simulation. And now, last but not least, we have the survey team, which you will hear about the most today, talking about a snapshot of distance simulation, including some unpublished work. So stay tuned, and I will hand this over now to Janice. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Isabel. So a lot of how we all came together was under Isabel's leadership. And initially it was just trying to figure out what do we call this thing? And then as you can see here, it has blossomed into many, many multiple separate projects, large projects. And the other one I also want to point out here is this pictogram, which we had realized it was very difficult to if, you know, in writing, what we would see in the literature is that it's still confusing in writing. And what we found was that if people diagrammed it out, if they had pictograms, it actually made much more sense. And so we also have a pictogram group that's looking at what is a way to use pictograms in describing what we're doing in distance simulation. So as Isabel said, we have been working on the scoping review. We have screened over 7,000 articles looking at what people are doing in distance simulation. And what we realized was, at least in the 2020 literature and 2021 literature, we thought, okay, well, we're going to IMSH, we're talking with other people, and they're all doing really wonderful things. We're not seeing it in the literature, maybe because the world is so busy trying to keep up. They're not having the time to publish, and hence this gave birth to the idea of, hey, let's do a survey. Maybe people do have time to at least take a survey and help us get a snapshot of what's going on beyond what's published in the literature. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So what we ended up doing was we assembled our core research team, and we met weekly and just did a ton of work making sure that the survey was well thought out. We did do IRB. We are writing up all of our results in addition to, you know, putting together this presentation so that we can disseminate our findings to all of you. And then, of course, we had a steering group composed of some of the large players who lead the 25 societies that Isabel introduced us to in the beginning of this talk. So as we were trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do for the IRB? What exactly is it that we want to know? Lucky for us, everything kind of collapsed into 3 phases. And so you're seeing the 3 phases here. So the first phase is really trying to understand, what does distance simulation look like? And then we decided, okay, phase 2, now we want to understand, how can we best inform educators? How can people best use whatever we found in phase 1 and use it to train educators and sim specialists? And then finally, phase 3 is trying to get us to where we essentially want to be, kind of the hot topic in online education, which is it as effective as in-person education? And so at the end of the talk, I'll kind of give you an outline of our research agenda and where we're going and what activities are leading toward there. But first, let's talk about the survey. So we did come up with the research questions. We did get IRB. We also, as we did the survey writing and piloting, we followed Artino's 7-step process. So we did have expert review. We piloted with 40 people. After we piloted, then we translated, sent those out to the different countries. We have 7 languages, and Julia is going to walk us through some of the robust process of this survey project.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Janice. Yes, so I'm going to speak a little bit about the overall design and recruitment for the survey, and then I will discuss survey development more specifically, diving into some of the key pieces that Janice just mentioned. So the survey was an open design. We used a convenient sample of members in our target population. This meant that anyone who had the link was able to complete the survey, and our target population was designed to be any adults who have any allocated or dedicated time to working in a simulation program. So this may have included administrators, educators, or clinical providers at any level of competency and with any amount of time dedicated to simulation. We did obtain ethical approval, and the project was deemed exempt by the Mass General Brigham IRB. And once we had that, we went to recruiting and we advertised the survey broadly because as I mentioned, it was an open survey design. And so we used our existing professional and online social networks, which included emails via Simulation Society listservs, local, regional, and national and international simulation centers and organizations listservs, and email lists, and also posting on social media. The survey was open from January through the beginning of March. Now to speak briefly about how we developed the survey more specifically. So our survey development team consisted of 8 healthcare simulation research experts and 2 experts in survey design. We started with a literature review, which was conducted by the core research group, as well as the scoping review team within our larger research team. We then met as a group after the literature review was completed, and we had several discussions among our core team to determine the key aspects of distance simulation that would best answer our research question, and identified several key themes that we wanted to explore in our survey. Once we had done this, we broke our core team into smaller groups, with each team sort of taking on one of the themes that we had identified and roughly outlining the questions that they thought would best give us insight into how that theme was playing out in distance simulation. Once this sort of rough list of questions had been developed, an expert in survey design on our team looked at those rough questions and developed specific survey items using best practices in survey design and input them into the online survey software tool. We used Qualtrics for this. Once we had done that, we went through the process of expert validation and pre-testing, where the core research group reviewed all of the survey items, both for clarity and to ensure that they reflected the concepts that we had identified as important to explore in our survey. And then after that, the survey underwent pilot testing. So as Janice mentioned, we sent out the survey to 40 pilot testers from the target population, and they were very deliberately recruited to represent multiple countries and roles within distance simulation. They then provided feedback to us on the survey via email, and we incorporated this into further edits. The final survey had 44 questions and was estimated to take approximately 15 minutes. And once we had this, we translated the survey into 7 languages. We used Qualtrics survey software, and all of the questions on our survey were optional except for the first 2, which were: did your survey center conduct distance simulation activities prior to COVID-19? And does your simulation center currently conduct distance simulation activities? Sorry for the backtrack, but I think that's everything that I wanted to say about the survey design process. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Yunsu Park. I'll be presenting the findings of the survey. Next slide, please. So we administered the survey in several different formats. We had this sent out in Qualtrics, and we measured different components as we will walk you through some of the main findings. We measured things like in-person use versus online, whether there were synchronous or asynchronous use of simulations and different learning modalities, the importance of leadership, satisfaction, and challenges that may vary by groups as well. Next slide, please. So when we administered the survey, in terms of the raw data that came back to us, we had a total of 708 responses, but we did some data cleaning. And so this resulted in a total data sample of 618 that we used for the analysis, and the presentation of the core findings will be based on the 618 sample. As my colleagues have mentioned earlier, the responses across many different languages. There was a total of 7 different languages that were used, and actually empirically found in our responses as well. The actual response time was about slightly over 9 minutes. That was the median time, with about anywhere between 2.5 minutes to all the way through to almost 17 minutes for the interquartile range. Within the US, we had, there were 32 respondents from across 32 different countries in the world. Within the United States, there were 44 states that had responses. We had a range of different people who were our respondents. About 43% spend less than half of their time dedicated to simulation, about 16% between 50 to 75%, and then slightly over 40% spend majority of their time, 75% or more. And as you can see here in the bottom of this slide, this shows the different roles that people have, ranging from simulation educator, 65%. These were check all that applies. So some of them check multiple roles that they have. And you can see at the bottom here, about 45% of our respondent had some administration or leadership role within their simulation center or unit. So now we'll actually start presenting some of our core findings from our survey. So one of the things that we've found, one more, next, please. Yes. So one of the things that we asked in the survey was, what was your distance simulation activities prior to the pandemic? There were about 28% of the respondents who used distance simulation. Now, the surprising result for us, or at least for me personally, was that this 28% goes up to 70%. So this is a huge increase following the COVID-19. Of course, statistically, this is a statistically significant increase, with all of the significance, and we have other subgroup analyses associated here. So that I think is a main thing, one of the main things that we found empirically to show the degree of change that's occurred. Now, among centers that currently were conducting distance simulation, 60% of them previously did not use distance simulation. So almost 2/3, I mean, this is a new thing for them. There were some programs, though, who were previously using distance simulation that are no longer using distance simulation. So about 7%, a very few minority, have decided no longer to continue distance simulation. Next slide, please. We also looked at changes over time in the simulation format. So here in the circles, it shows you different simulation modalities. The first one at the top, the changes, this is last year in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, so March to May. So about 50% of the respondents used some form of distance simulation. Later in the year, last year, that 50% goes up to 55%. So it's a bit stable in terms of that change. Now you can see that change in comparison to the bottom two circles, which is the hybrid and the in-person. So for the hybrid, earlier on in the pandemic, only 16% of the respondents were using hybrid simulation, but this went up to 40%. And you can see also the same for in-person as well, from 23% to 56%. So there were changes in the hybrid as well as in-person. And we later on in the survey, we also asked, what is your long-term plan? So long-term plan is to go hybrid, and that was about 82%. We'll discuss this a bit further as we walk down through the results. Some of the slides coming up, I'll go through them a bit quickly to pick up some of the core findings as well. So here in this slide, we asked the question, what was factors prompting your unit, your organization to develop distance simulation? And there were three key things. These are the three top things. These are, again, check all that apply. So the highest was access to technology, access to personnel, interest in simulation instructors were the top three factors that prompted them to develop the distance simulation. Next slide, please. We also asked in the next few slides, what are the different modalities of learning? So here, we first asked them, where do majority of your procedural simulations occur? And we gave them different options. So is it in person, online? If it's online, synchronous versus asynchronous, and so forth. So procedural simulation by far still occurred in the in-person environment. And you can see that if you look at this in the aggregate for procedural simulation, slightly higher in the not separated column, but the majority were happening in the in-person setting. Next slide, please. Now contrast the procedural now to clinical event-based or team-based simulation. And here you can now begin seeing a distribution of different modalities of simulation. So here you can see not only in person where there are separated and not separated, but you can also begin seeing online synchronous modalities of learning that happen for clinical event or team-based simulation, which is slightly different, again, from the prior slide, which was majority of the procedural were happening in person. Now, yes. So again, you can see that distribution. Now contrast this with simulated patient setting, where most of the learning modality is broken up into in-person, not separated, or online synchronous learning for simulated patient learning modality. So much more to discuss in the upcoming slides as well. Next slide. We also asked, as part of our survey, what are the reasons, not factors, but what are the reasons for developing distance simulation at simulation centers during the COVID-19 pandemic? And by far, the biggest reason here is center leadership. And we did some subgroup analysis here, asking if they were really higher level administrators or leaders within their unit, they had even a greater preference. So leadership matters as far as these survey responses. Next slide, please. We also asked them, objectives in the transition to distance simulation at your simulation center during the COVID-19 pandemic. And if we compare some of the different learning that happens, the main reason for them to develop was to continue existing simulation offerings. This was over 70% of the results. Next slide, please. Here we asked them, what is your long-term plan for distance simulation? Again, the maintaining the hybrid was 82%, so that's at the top bar here. And you can contrast this with, back to in-person, which is only 11%, and then far fewer, which was, different scatters of responses in the other category. So going to a hybrid modality would be something to look out for in future research. We also asked them, our respondents, a question about training for educators and technicians. Here again, just to emphasize the importance of educator training so that they are prepared to deliver this distance simulation modality as well. Next slide, please. We asked a slide around perceived satisfaction at simulation center. Here, I'm just highlighting the top 3 satisfied groups. Here, the satisfied groups are the simulation program leaders, again, having a high satisfaction, followed by program educators, and then organizational leaders. So you can see that their responses are over 60% satisfaction. Down this list, you will also see in contrast people who may not have expressed a higher degree of satisfaction relative to the other colleagues, who are instructional designers, 43%, standardized patients, 36%. Next slide, please. I believe this is perhaps the last slide for my part. Types of simulation sessions during distance simulation. Again, these are different simulation session learning modalities. So we have continuing education, orientation and competency training, OSCEs, task training, and team training. So I think a flow of different modalities of simulation learning environments that happen as part of distance simulation.
Great, so I'm going to speak a little bit about the limitations and challenges of the approach that we took. So first, as we have discussed, this was an open survey, which meant that anyone with the link could take the survey. And we didn't send out the survey to a specific target population or sample within our target population. And so for that reason, we cannot calculate a specific response rate to the survey, and because we don't know the denominator for the population that had access to the link. But we chose to do it this way deliberately because we felt it allowed us to reach the maximum number of respondents who may not have otherwise had access to the survey if we hadn't made the link so publicly available. Second is that the survey was not, it was on the longer side for surveys. We estimated that it took sort of 12 to 15 minutes to complete this survey. And so while that's a much shorter period of time than it would have taken to, for example, write up what someone was doing in their distance simulation practices, as Janice had mentioned, it still was a time commitment. And so we wonder whether there were, how many people were not able to take the survey because of the time commitment. And we did see this in the 12.5% of people who opened the survey, but then didn't complete it in a meaningful way. Next, we decided deliberately to make almost all of the survey questions optional to protect respondents' privacy and to encourage people to complete the survey, even if there were questions that they didn't feel comfortable answering or didn't want to answer for any reason. The downside of this meant that some respondents did not answer all of the questions, and this became particularly relevant when we were looking at the demographic data for the survey, where we couldn't always decipher, for example, how many respondents came from an individual institution because this wasn't filled out in every survey response. And last is that we, had a robust representation of multiple countries, but we wonder whether we may have had opportunities to gather responses from a more diverse list of countries. For example, if we had a member on our committee who represented countries that were less well represented in the survey data, for example, Australia.
So one of the drivers, we're talking about drivers, one of the drivers for the survey research is to understand the drivers of what prompted organizations and centers to actually do and pivot to distance simulation. So I would love to hear from all of you. If you would just type in chat, like what drove you to do distance simulation? And I'm just gonna run this as a little exercise here to figure out if any of the findings around drivers is at all surprising or if it's not surprising at all. COVID, so COVID's definitely one. Lack of clinical sites, continued support, royal decree, Cynthia, this is in Saudi Arabia, to move everything all online. And I think a lot of organizations had that decree as well. And it's, all of you are educators, or most of you maybe, it's difficult to pivot when you don't really know or feel comfortable or have not done it before. So hence how we're going to go into phase 2. So great. I'm seeing, shutdown, limitation for room capacities. So no, nothing very surprising here in terms of what we found with drivers. This was open text. And you're all pretty much mentioning the same reasons that we saw in the survey. So health regulations, the social distancing requirements, the clinical practice time, the necessity to continue that, requirements to continue training for graduation. We saw a lot of that. The need to train because of COVID, that was our first response, and safety concerns and worries around, contact precautions and bringing people together in face-to-face environments. So nothing very surprising in terms of drivers that we found. However, if anything, I think in terms of future agenda and how we move forward looking at this, it's really understanding while, per the driver, did we meet the intent of that drive by doing distance simulation? And so more on that in a few minutes. Michael.
We asked the following question: to what extent are the following simulation modalities used for distance simulation at your simulation center? And simulation modalities during the COVID-19 pandemic have been diverse. While procedural simulation and team-based simulation are mainly in person as expected, simulations with simulated patients seem to shift toward online participation. This difference might be explained by the hands-on objectives, which necessitate in-person simulation versus communication objectives, for which distance simulation is more feasible. We wanted to learn about the participant experience with the preparation and realization of distance simulation by comparing it with in-person simulation. Could you put the next slide, please? Thanks. Overall, all the educational aspects of simulation were more difficult to prepare and to lead in distance simulation, including creation of the educational content and as well as teaching during the simulation session. We can explain this by the change of settings and the need to adapt the learning objectives. And the next slide. The simulation follows a structure that we have summarized in 3 stages: the pre-briefing, the simulation, and the debriefing. Unlike the educational aspects described earlier, answers were more variable. The distance pre-briefing was more challenging for only 38% of the respondents, while the distance simulation was more challenging for 67%. So in conclusion, these findings suggest that training of educators and guidelines are needed to facilitate transition to distance simulation.
Thank you, guys. Sorry, I was muted. So one of the things that I think has come up that you've seen in the previous slides from the survey, one of the big questions for, I think, all of us that we were very curious about is how are the simulation technicians and educators prepared for the distance simulation, if at all, and how imperative is the training? And what we learned, which I think was surprising for myself as someone who was formally trained to be a simulation educator, is that most people were not trained even before the pandemic, and that while we sort of transitioned into distance simulation during the pandemic, even more people were not trained to do this. And so in essence, many people were sort of thrown into that educator role without really having sort of the wherewithal to sort of know how to facilitate and do the different aspects of a simulation that would be distance. And I think that one of the things to think about here is, well, what is the impact if we are not preparing our educators to learn how to do distance simulation and be effective at it? Because certainly this is going to translate into how our learners are actually using that material through simulation. So I would say, yes, it is imperative. And I think that speaks to the question of, is there a way to create something that would be disseminatable to the larger group as a whole in terms of how to train people to actually do this type of distance simulation? Next slide. And so that sort of segues into the next question. What topics need to be covered for adequate training, and how do we ensure it? And I think that once again, what we learned was that the sim technicians actually had more training in terms of using platforms, being technologically savvy, but yet again, educators were not. And I think that we need to figure out what are the things that absolutely need to be translated to our educators so that they can do the job, a standard that we want them to keep. And so thinking about the different aspects of distance simulation. So there's conditions that foster distance simulation, correct? So what are the needs in terms of access to technology? There's different materials and software. There are different platforms. There's no one size that fits all, but we should be aware of what those are. Access to personnel. Who are the people that are going to be educating? One of the things that we learned was that some people volunteered. Other people were sort of assigned to it. And I think that has to be thought about very carefully. There needs to be support from simulation instructors, the organization, and the program for this to be effective. How much technical and trained human resource are key points for distance simulation development? I think that this is a resource that hasn't been thought about enough. What is that training? Who's going to do it? How much time needs to be allocated to it? So I think those are really important questions. Next slide, please. And so training characteristics, and this speaks to what I sort of previously talked about with the initial questions. There's limited training, even for the new distance simulation program. And I can tell you myself, as someone that also got thrown into it with the pandemic, I had done a little bit, but not a lot. And another colleague of mine down at Nemours, we ended up sort of troubleshooting a lot of things in real time and then writing sort of a tips and tricks paper. But, it would have been nice to have had that troubleshooting done pre the distance simulation pandemic issues that arose. So limited prior teaching and training, and there's definitely room for improvement here. And I think that we need guidelines and training staff on how to do distance simulation so that we can be effective, so that we are ensuring that our learners are really getting what they need. A lot of that is also figuring out how to assess them with distance simulation that we haven't quite touched on. And then the training content, I think, is something that we need to ponder. What's the theory we're teaching? What are the teaching and learning considerations for distance education? And terms of technical skills, like what's the platform that's going to be effective for distance simulation, and can it be as effective, and how does that compare to true in-person simulation? So there's a lot of questions that came out of this, and we need to start thinking about what those answers are and then how to disseminate them. So a lot more work to be done here.
Great. So as I was listening to everybody's presentation, and as we were going through the whole process of this, what our first intent was to get a snapshot. And so I think we've gotten a really nice snapshot. And what kind of emerged is we had this 60% increase in distance simulation where people hadn't done it before. We had, educators that hadn't been trained in either the technical aspects or the theory. And yet somehow they all made it work. And so I think a lot of this is due to the nature of who we are as simulation-based educators. And so we just, we have the expertise with making it work and adapting on the fly. And so we kind of did it, and you saw the satisfaction thing. So how do we make it even better? So how do we take that adaptive expertise that we use to make it work and get a roadmap or a deliberate practice going forward? So instead of trying to make it work for the next time we have to change to online learning or distance education, that we have something that's a tool that we can provide as a guideline. I'm going to apologize because I wanted to change this graphic because I'm too used to thinking of Miller's pyramid, and it makes it look like there's a top. There really isn't a top. This was just what are the component pieces that we need to think about. So we've talked a little bit about what do we do for faculty and staff development in terms of technical and theory training, right? What are the tools? What platforms worked and didn't work? I mean, I know we evaluated so many different platforms. Some of them were really good, some of them not so good. How do we look at some of those things? And how are we assessing the learning outcomes? Gabe Reedy and I presented at SASEM last week, and one of the questions that came up is, what if any best practices are there for remote or virtual debriefing? So there's all these things that we need to look at about how we can provide information to educators. So some of the questions that came up is, what competencies would be ideal for distance simulation? So what are the things that you need to teach them in terms of the technical things and in terms of the theory? Because I know I didn't have previous training in distance education, and I did a lot of reading after this all started. What types of training could we do for faculty and staff development? And what are those outcome measures that we should be looking at besides satisfaction? And I'm, biased because I think of the satisfaction as like the happy face, but what are the actual outcomes that we're looking at? So for translational outcomes, so that how can we look to see if this is really meaningful? And what are those things that we think, hey, I got better outcomes doing some of this stuff online than I did in person. So how do I know what I should switch back to 100% in person? And what are those things that can stay hybrid and free up some of the space in my simulation center? So those are some things that we're going to be looking at going forward. And Janice gave you the roadmap for it, and she's going to go back to, yes, that's great. Margaret McCool has done several things, and thanks, Susie, for adding that to the chat. So Janice is going to go back to the roadmap, and we're going to talk about where we go next. And then we're going to unmute you and turn on your video so we can have your opinions and impressions from what you need to hear and want to learn more about.
Thanks, Susan. So this was the initial slide that I had shown in terms of our research agenda, in terms of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And so phase 1, we are wrapping up. It was a consensus summit around distance simulation, a scoping review that we're also wrapping up, and then of course this survey work. And we are now transitioning into phase 2, which is a second scoping review for the last 6 months, because that was where the first scoping review ended. And then another consensus meeting, now focusing on what information do you need to know to be able to do this better based off of everything that we found in phase 1. In phase 3, we are part of the 2023 SSH Research Summit that we have periodically to basically present guidelines on reporting guidelines for this work. And we've been noticing a lot in the scoping review of it's very hard to collect the data and be able to make recommendations based off of the variety of how people are actually publishing in ways that, we can't really understand the methodology that was used. So that is really going to be a systematic review. So please look out for all of this work that's coming down the pipeline to help us understand how to do our jobs better in the innovative space of the online environment. And with that, I'd like to just put our contact information up here. Feel free to screenshot. I know the recording is going to be available as well. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, if you have any suggestions, like Susan said, in a minute, we're going to invite you to unmute and turn on your videos. And we would love to hear your thoughts. We would love to hear your questions. A lot of this might translate into the work that we're currently doing. Perhaps you might be interested in joining some of our efforts as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Christina.
Oh, everyone is not able to unmute and start your video. So if you have any questions, and if you are unable to unmute yourself, type your question in the chat box and one of us will read it aloud.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. Questions, thoughts, comments?
Hey, this is Ben Berg in Hawaii from the
Hi, Ben.
simulation. Hi, Janice. So we had a really kind of interesting, unexpected downstream effect when we transitioned a faculty development course, an international faculty development course, to the online format. It included some active live simulation. I won't go into those details, but the unexpected downstream effect was we doubled or tripled the number of people that participated in our course compared to those that participated in our face-to-face course. We had a 2-day face-to-face course. It was actually conducted in Japan. And we struggled to get 15 or 20 people to the courses, and we had to cut off our online activities at about 40, and there were more that wanted to do it. So we're continuing it. So it was sort of a force multiplier, if you will, by going online. We really didn't expect that.
I'm not sure, Barbara, if you're here, if you'll speak up. I'm not sure if this question is for the panel or if it's for Ben.
It's for the panel, and I missed the first part of the presentation, so I apologize if this was already covered, but I'm curious if you found any evidence of unintended harm during remote simulations. And I don't mean safety, just safety harms. I mean psychological harm as well.
Thank you, Barbara. And I can speak to that. And Ben, since you have done this, please join us in this conversation. And then also panelists, if you have experience that you'd like to mention, please do. I can speak to some of the work that I've been doing with some of our PhD students. They are studying factors of engagement in online debriefings. And they did look at psychological safety. And very interestingly, there are factors, internal factors that lead to external factors. So thoughts and judgments that drive your actions. So for example, you are so conscious of your background, let's say, that you turn off your video, and that in that way, it changes the dynamic of the engagement because everyone might have this assumption that you're not engaged because you've turned off your video. Some teachers have intentionally staged their background to have dirty plates, to kind of normalize for their students that, hey, it's okay to turn on your video, to help make it more psychologically safe. We were actually shocked in our scoping review looking at that work that there wasn't much on people hearing outside of, I hear this a lot with K through 12 students. that they're very embarrassed about the noise in their household, so they'll go to their closet and take their Zoom classes from their closet. We didn't find that in the adult literature, which was interesting. So I can only speak to the literature and some personal experience, and I'm sure a lot of you on this call right now have personal experiences with simulation that touches on psychological safety. Please, I invite you to unmute.
And there were a few comments in the chat box too.
And Janice, just to speak to that, the video aspect especially, I've done online courses. So just like it said earlier, is that, yes, it can increase the participation. And we had people coming from Singapore who might not have come to the course otherwise. But there's things with the distance simulation or any type of those courses that it's like, what is the bandwidth that people have with their Wi-Fi? And so how do you make sure that it's, we had some discussions regarding equity and access. And so it's like, did everybody have abilities to do that? The other thing that I found is you had to be very explicit about things that you do to create psychological safety. So things that you might have done that were nonverbal in the past, when you transition to the virtual environment, you had to explicitly state some of those things, or just some of your body language is lost in that. So those things had to be kind of stated, whereas before you might have used nonverbal things or just a nod or a smile, because people can't see that necessarily online. So it was just a change in how you interacted with everybody online.
And the PhD students that I was mentioning, Cynthia Mosher and Alex Morton, if you're here, please also feel free to unmute and contribute. Any other thoughts or questions or comments?
There was another one in the chat, and I apologize if it was already announced. I'm double calling right now. But there's one that says, was there data regarding the disciplines? Did some transition more than others?
Yunsu and Julia, do you have that off the top of your head? I'll pull up my qualitative data.
Just take a high-level response here. I think this is this is a very important question, and I think this is something that we plan to look further into. But we know in terms of not disciplines, but the roles that people had. So, for example, if it's a center that had leadership that were more motivated to go through this transition, I think that was a big factor in changing. Whether there were specific disciplines or specialties that had faster transition, that I think we'll need to do some more analyses as we move forward, and other subgroups as well.
The next question. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Yunsu, for that comment. I can just speak from the scoping review team to think about what literature have we seen in the years past, not just during the pandemic. We have been seeing a lot of articles in the nursing literature. I would say more than in the physician literature, and within physicians, it was mainly surgeons. I mean, just a little nugget from the scoping review, what happened before the pandemic. But of course, most of us are more interested in what's happening during the pandemic.
The next question is there any data, research, or anecdotal on how sim educators have leveraged the chat function in the web conferencing platforms to promote learner engagement?
And it looks like someone else put in, we specifically use the chat for those high latency, weak internet connections. And that's a really good answer to that, that equity issue and that access issue. So it's like, then people can feel like they can engage even if their video doesn't work. I said, Janice very deliberately did it earlier when she said, hey, everybody, we know what some of the drivers are. Why don't you put these in the chat? So I know when we do online courses, we do that frequently too. So it's, let's, ask a question, have people add it to the chat. However, I've noticed it's helpful to have a moderator because otherwise the chat function can become this own conversation. So if you can imagine you're in person and doing a lecture and you have the three people talking in the back of the room and it kind of distracts from the whole thing. So it's like, how do you moderate the chat to ensure that you've got active engagement and yet not let it become its own little subtopic away? So you know, we just usually, when I've done courses, we assign someone to moderate the chat. And if it seems like that thing is getting really big and interesting, we may pause who's ever like talking or debriefing and say, hey, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge this thing that's this really interesting conversation going on in the chat. And I think it's a big enough focus that I'd love to bring it back to the big group and see what we think about it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just like any online learning, thank you, Grace, for your question. Having a co-faculty or another faculty kind of monitoring the chat, I agree with Susan. It's so individual. Some people are completely distracted and they'd rather not look at it. And other people, you know, based on, let's say, personality, would prefer to not interrupt the actual discussion and place their questions in chat. And so it's, you know, in instructional design world, they call this universal design. So making sure that it's inclusive for all the different learning styles and personalities. So I would say I have been in meetings where they're like, no chat at all, everything upfront, verbal. And I just think that's not inclusive to some people. Instead, what I like to do is have someone else kind of assigned to monitor the chat. And then, as Susan said, bring it forward into the discussion. Les, I see your hand up.
Regarding the chat, I just wanted to mention that we actually use it to our advantage. So we have a large screen that we bring into the Sim Center. We put that up, and basically what we call our avatars, or the folks that are in that role of either the attending or the nurse or the family member, we'll actually sort of watch what's going on in the dialogue that directs some of the scripting. But also, for example, if I'm playing the role of the nurse and I'm doing something, we're going to reinforce team steps by telling them, if you need something done, please place the order in. So we use it almost as an order system. They place the order in. When I complete something, we establish an IV or we hang a med, I will close the loop back and say, Nurse Donnie, IVs have been hung. Here's what you have. Labs were sent. And same thing, if they want labs for blood work, they need to list out what they want in that chat. That way there's a sort of team steps of closing that loop.
Barb, I think you were going to say something.
I wanted to piggyback off of that. Yeah, thanks. So my group used the chat in a little bit of a different way. We're sort of back in person right now, but we've done hybrid with our attendings. And so I run pediatric emergency resuscitation cases for my fellows, with one attending, nursing, pharmacy, etc. And the rest of our pediatric ER faculty would Zoom in and watch. And what was nice is, as the case was in evolution, they would have a chat back and forth, totally engaged, running their own differential, talking to each other about what they would do, making commentary on what was going on. And in a way, at the end, I could run through it quickly and see if there were other debriefing points that maybe I missed or something that I kind of forgot about. So it was almost like a tally for me. That was sort of like a bunch of other pair of eyes watching and helping me. So it actually was great in that they were sort of working collaboratively together as PEM faculty, going through the case themselves, but also giving me a little boost with my debrief. So everybody was really benefiting from it. So it worked well for our group. Just use it is the point.
The other thing that we're able to do is we actually have them rename themselves within each of their Zooms, obviously. So we have them put whatever their team role is. So if they're team leader or airway or monitor or whatever position they are, and then their first name. So when we're communicating back and forth, or they put something in that chat, we know exactly, oh, this came from the team lead. It's an order. Let me respond back to it. If it's just dialogue between them, we leave it alone.
Thank you, Les. Such great ideas.
Can I add one thing from Les's thing about renaming yourself in the chat. I love it with the roles, but it's also depending on what course we do. We will have people just rename to have just their first name. So, you know, it's like if we talk about that psychological safety aspect, so it's like, so it doesn't, so it just is one of those things to make it more personal. It's like, you know, today I'm very deliberately Susan Ella from Stanford because we were presenting, but, you know, if I'm just doing a course, I might just change it to Susan because it adds that, you know, sense of interpersonal connection.
I do see some questions here. And so Isabel, I'm going to ask you this question, just modeling, bringing some chat discussion into the verbal discussion. The question is why we chose distance rather than remote or virtual in describing distance simulation.
Oh, what a wonderful question. Thank you, Janice. And thank you for whoever asked the question. I can't see it right now. Scrolling. We had countless discussions. Whenever I'm in an environment where simulationists that are passionate about this concept, this phenomenon, come together, 45 minutes of the discussion is about nomenclature, meaning what are we calling this? So it is within our group, we chose to use the word distance simulation. For a number of reasons. We have conducted a Delphi process and looked into what is the most commonly used word, what do people actually prefer to use. There were huge fights around it, and the top three, which a third of people preferring each one of them, were telesimulation versus remote simulation versus distance simulation. I personally didn't like the word remote simulation because it made it seem like I'm at Yale, the ivory tower, talking down to people somewhere else, and you're remote, and I'm obviously local. And that was I felt remote had a certain judgment in it. Telesimulation for me is more of an operator term, saying it's tele, so it's more like a, you know. So for me personally, I love distance simulation because I'm more of a facilitator and simulation-based researcher. But that being said, you are still welcome to use whichever term works best for your context. There is no such thing as one term that fits all. Sorry, that was a long answer, but this is
no, it was a really interesting process because the whole point of the summit was to come together and have consensus on what we were going to use, and what we found was that nobody could agree. And everybody, and we all have preconceived notions of each of the different terms. So virtual was one that was thrown out pretty easily because people were confused with virtual reality and virtual simulation. And then telesimulation, while that was more neutral than virtual, telesimulation was confused with telemedicine. And so everybody has these preconceived notions. And so we've decided to go with the most neutral of terms, which is distance. And it looks like Grace has a question there. It looks like it's a analysis question. I don't know if you both see that, you and Sue and Julia. And then there's also another question on negative feedback with hybrid sims, if we got anything about that.
I can answer the question about Grace's question about funding. So my recollection thinking back to the survey is that I don't think that we specifically listed funding as one of the options, but there was absolutely a free text option. And so if someone had sort of been thinking about that, at least sort of saliently, they could have entered it. And I don't know if those who were looking at the qualitative data saw that pop up as something that stuck out as something that people were mentioning.
Probably helpful would be if I had sent everyone on the file. I don't know if I could do file transfer, the actual survey questions. So if you're interested, I'm going to go ahead and try to do that.
I'll just say while you're doing that we listed resources, like lack of resources, I think, as a potential barrier, but I don't think we were specific about like monetary resources versus other types of resources.
Okay, so Christina, it looks like I can't upload a file directly. I have to do like whatever these options are here.
You could email it to me and I'll upload it with the PowerPoint.
Okay.
And then I just wanted to do a quick time check. We have about 3 minutes left. So presenters, did you want to do a close up or just continue with Q&A?
I'm happy to continue with Q&A. If there's anyone that has a burning question that we haven't answered yet.
Somebody mentioned negative feedback on the hybrid. I'm finding that my faculty, I'm new to simulation educator, and I'm finding that the faculty is somewhat feeding the students about not being able to learn this in a distant environment. And they're really pushing to get all their students back into the simulation center, which we have some limitations at my center. What is how are people handling that? I'm finding that to be a large barrier in my role.
In terms of the survey questions, we did not ask specifically a question around this. I think we did see in the levels of satisfaction that Yunsu presented. And so I think this is more a question for everyone. What have you been seeing in terms of negative feedback?
I'll make a comment. It's a little bit of organizational change. Maybe obviously you've got a large representation in the survey from directors and administrators, but that's really, it has to start from both the top and the bottom, and it has to meet in the middle. So if you can get that organizational change, I think it needs to come from both ends of it. And it's just human nature that, there's enough stuff going on already, but you have to help them through that change a little bit.
Right.
All right, thank you, everyone. I want to be conscious of the time here. We are at the hour now. I put my email in the chat. I love this conversation because it does flow nicely into our phase 2 focus of looking at how to educate educators or how to do this better. And so thinking about the negative feedback that we're getting when we're doing distance simulation, I think is going to be important. So if you have more comments around this particular question, please email me. I'll go ahead and send Christina the document so you have a copy of the slides as well as a copy of the survey if you're interested in that. And then we are working on publication. Stay tuned for that. And anything else, panelists, before we go? Julie.
I'm just so thrilled with the fact that we had so many members, people across the globe participate. That was I think, and that we're all in this together. That was so compelling through this. So yeah, I'm excited that this group has done so much great work, and I'm looking forward to, more happening. So.
All right, I want to thank SSH for having us. Would love to thank all of you that took the survey. Also, please look out for the second survey because we will be doing more details around that. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening, afternoon.